when you pissed him off or when he was pissed at the game, you knew it right away. Like, there was no guessing.
Welcome into Northside Territory, Foul Territories Cubs podcast. I'm Sahadev Sharma with my co-host Patrick Mooney. We're your Cubs beat writers over at The Athletic. Patrick, we have a guest today, the Mets beat writer, Will Sammon. Will's got a lot to talk about since the Cubs are playing the Mets soon. We have a lot of overlap here. He covered Craig Counsell for multiple years in Milwaukee. So, Will, welcome. Patrick, why don't you take it away with the first question to Will?
Will, thank you for joining us. You do a fantastic job covering the Mets for The Athletic. Love reading your stuff, especially when the team has been yo-yoing back and forth. I feel like you were starting to prepare another one of yours where the season went wrong disaster stories, and then they just picked it up. So, I don't know, give us a snapshot here of like where the Mets are at several weeks out from the trade deadline. How do you see this unfolding?
Well, I woke up today, and some of the things that kind of went through my mind as I thought about work was, wow, what are the little anecdotes I could pull from when this team goes above 500 from the few weeks leading up to it? We're not quite there yet here with this team, but things are trending in the right direction finally. After they started 0-5, and then they won a few games in a row, and they looked okay, and then they stumbled again, and they never really were able to right it after that. So things are different now, though, and a lot of that is just because of the offense, I think, at least. A lot of people will point to some silly things and, a players-only meeting, and that had something to do with it, I think, actually. After Jorge Lopez, newest member of the Cubs, I guess, right?
Our guy.
Yeah. After he tossed his glove and they got embarrassed by the Dodgers, and they embarrassed themselves in that series, they had this players-only meeting, and I think a lot of stuff actually came out of that. I know that, like, in the media, we could make a whole lot of fuss about that, but a lot of good stuff came out of that, and I think it's just a good example of a veteran team finally maybe realizing what's in front of them and understanding with the right players in that room, a guy like JD Martinez, Francisco Lindor, like what it's going to take to change things around. And so I think it's a lot of like regression to the mean in some ways with the lineup. And that will take them, I think, at least far enough to keep them in the conversation in the NL wild card picture, which we know is pretty jumbled anyway.
Will, I think Cubs fans are still, well, maybe not at this point in time, but there are Cubs fans that still want the team to buy and be aggressive and get that bat. And they want it to happen now, right? And I think Pete Alonso is someone everyone talks about, related to the Cubs. Are the Mets even close to thinking about selling? It seemed like a couple of weeks ago that was an inevitability, but is that even on their minds right now? And are they shifting to thinking about buying? Is this a wait and see mode for them? And is Alonso, I would assume Alonso would be available.
Yeah, so like what they tell me is that they're not there yet with this. And a lot of times in my mind when I hear that, I'm like, okay, well, that's probably not the truth. But in this context, I believe it just because of, like I just said before, of how jumbled things are in the wild card picture, where you could really sell yourself on the idea of making it. And then, like, why would you rip things apart if you're able to make the playoffs? I mean, this was a roster and a front office that said especially after JD Martinez, but even before that, in the beginning of spring training, they were talking about wanting to make the playoffs. And sites like Fangraphs actually had them right on the cusp of that. They didn't have them as a huge percentage to make it, but they were in the wild card picture. And then when they added JD Martinez, that to me demonstrated like, hey, they are serious about wanting to improve this team and wanting to make the playoffs while also trying to get a good look at some of their young players. They want to do both. It's hard to live in both of those worlds, but right now they look like they can pull it off. And so, like, why would you rip the Band-Aid off and like say like, okay, no, we're not going to do it, actually, especially now after you win some games and you show and prove yourself like, hey, we can actually make this run. As far as Pete Alonso goes, yeah, he would be their biggest trade chip or one of their biggest, because I've had some people tell me that Luis Severino would probably generate a larger return actually, just because of the amount of pitching that's needed across the board. But make no mistake, I mean, if Pete Alonso is out there, he will get you something, right? I mean, he's a perennial power threat. The thing with that though is I don't foresee the Mets really being in a rush to make that decision, one, because of where they are in the standings, but also like Steve Cohen wants to compete. I think that's a huge part of who he is. As the Mets owner, he wants to put a winning product out there. And there's a part of him that is pretty competitive, that wants to be in there. And there's another part of him that I think is very pragmatic, that goes back to his business side of things. And that's what we saw last year when he said to himself, let's cut our losses and let's make these trades. So there's both of those things at play. And as we talk still, not even in the final week of June here, it's just too early for the Mets to decide which one they want to go to. And at the end of the day, could I see them standing pat? Probably not, just because of the flexibility of their roster. They have a ton of guys signed to one-year deals, so they may make some like hybrid moves of sorts where they get rid of this guy but get this guy kind of thing. I could totally see that under David Stearns. But as far as like outright selling, I feel like that conversation is shifting a little bit now.
With Alonso being a free agent after this year, I forget exactly when, but he switched to Scott Boras, and obviously Boras has a relationship with Steve Cohen. He brought Brandon Nimmo back, but I'm sure Pete Alonso loves New York, but like that agent switch doesn't scream like, I want to sign a deal or an extension with this team. Like, is Boras an obstacle, or how is that variable in the equation when you look at the Mets and Pete Alonso, which has been like a great relationship, but may have an expiration date?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's an indication that like he doesn't want to re-sign with New York, but it is an indication that he wants to see what he's worth on the open market. That to me is clear, because we've seen some Boras agents, and Brandon Nimmo is an example of that. He re-signed with the Mets after adding Scott Boras as his agent. That came just as similar as Alonso did. Right ahead of his walk year, Brandon Nimmo switched agencies to Scott Boras. He ended up re-signing after seeing what he was worth and getting quite a large deal from Steve Cohen in New York, as a matter of fact. Now, I don't know with David Stearns and this new front office if they'd be inclined to – it's more of a question of how long are they inclined to go with Pete Alonso on a deal, I think, because – you know, he means a lot to New York. He probably means more to the Mets than any other team because he's a homegrown star and the cachet that could build you with some fans. But they're also not a dumb organization here. Like, they're trying to make some good moves. They're trying to, and they see a guy who is playing first base and is at a position where that doesn't tend to age gracefully. So I'm not sure how long they can go. That said, I think he's a little bit better defensively than people give him credit for. And we'll see what kind of strides he makes towards the end of this year to maybe give a better full picture of his offensive potential as he gets a little bit older.
There's this talk a lot in Chicago about the lack of a superstar in the lineup. Do you think the Mets have a superstar in their lineup, an offensive superstar? Does Alonso fit that category? Lindor, has cachet. I don't know if he's an offensive superstar. Would you look at Pete Alonso and say that's an offensive superstar?
He's not Aaron Judge, right? Like that's and it's funny. It's funny I say that just because since like 2019, I see this stat a lot. Probably nobody outside of New York does, but Alonso has hit the most home runs since 2019, more than Judge, right? And so that's a stat that gets popped out there all the time. But he's not Aaron Judge. He is not that type of superstar. He's not Juan Soto. They're both, I think, in that tier or two below. And it's hard for me to really pinpoint where exactly, because things are so blown up in New York that they are kind of huge stars here. Right. But outside of New York, do you really think, when you say to yourself, who are the top 5-10 players, those guys don't really get named. And I think we see that even reflected in the All-Star balloting, where they're not really anywhere close. And that's after obviously a slow start to the season in some regards for them. But yeah, I don't really see them as major superstars, but they are stars here, I would say.
You mentioned David Stearns, who you covered in Milwaukee, and he's doing his thing in New York. Craig Counsell is here in Chicago. the Brewers are still rolling. Are you surprised? And what is their secret?
I'm a little surprised because I didn't like the Corbin Burns trade at first, and I think I even like blasted it. I said it like sucked. I was like, "What are they doing here?" It's like it's so tired of like just like the we got to win every year type of thing. Like, you guys an ace, like you want to win now.
Yeah.
Good. But it's worked out. Like it's crazy. That kid Ortiz that they got is great. He's done really well. But what other people around the game pointed out to me when I had the conversations about the Brewers and Craig Counsell, even for that matter, is Craig got a lot of I think respect and a lot of fanfare for like his management of the bullpen over in Milwaukee, and lo and behold, their bullpen is cooking without him. And so what somebody told me was like, hey, they've kind of cracked the code like a few of these other teams around the league as far as getting affordable guys off the fringes, off the waiver wire, tinkering with their stuff, and just building out the depth that way. And so they've kind of made it, I don't want to say like idiot proof, but that's super harsh, but they've made it so that there's a bunch of arms in there that like if you're a veteran guy like a Pat Murphy or a Craig Counsell who's been in this game for a long time and you know what you're doing, you have depth to pull from there, and they've been tested. I mean, it's kind of weird to say that because they've had so many injuries and so many pitching issues over there, but I think it's a testament to just how their front office works and just how good they are at pitching development that they have all these arms at their disposal, and they just keep churning them out. And so for me, that's the biggest difference that I see, and that's really dawned on me, is that like, yes, Craig Counsell definitely is a superb manager, and Pat Murphy probably is too. I haven't covered him on that level, but a lot of it comes down to, I think, just the way their infrastructure is built over there and just the difference of pitching development and how far and how much they can get squeezed out from that.
It's funny that you bring that up. They just don't get a lot of publicity for what they do well there, right, in Milwaukee. And I remember years ago, I wrote about the Cubs pitching lab, and I had a lot of details in there, right? A lot of background. And someone from the Brewers texted me and like, what the hell? Who's giving you this information and why? Like, why would they tell you this? Like, we would never tell anybody in the media any of this stuff, is essentially what they said. I didn't think there was anything groundbreaking in there that I wrote. It was info and it was useful. But I just find like the Brewers are insanely secretive, right? And you know that, Will, right? That like I'm sure you've known whenever there's someone in the public that's hired by the Brewers and they say I can't, like someone's hired from the public and they say I've been hired by an MLB team, I can't say who. It's always the Brewers. That's always who it is, right? But my point is like, is it player development that is the standout there? Is it pro scouting? Is it I know their amateur scouting's had better results of late. Like, what is is it all of it working hand in hand? Like, what stands out there?
Yeah, I think they do a good job, similar to the Cleveland Guardians, about just they were early teams with like this pitching space of like saying to themselves, hey, like there's a lot of information out there, and I don't want to say it's a low risk, but it's a huge investment that we can make in this. And this will kind of close the gap for us and get us to a consistent level where we could kind of compete with teams that are going to outspend us. And so if we invest in this space, in player development and technology for pitching especially, then we can make up some ground. And so they're seeing the fruits of that. And I think that's the biggest difference between why they are or have been. Maybe this year's a little bit different, but their pitching development and their hitting development were two totally different things. And we see that across the Guardians are another example of that, right? Where they always have good pitching and then hitting is suspect. It's very similar to the Brewers. And a lot of that comes down to those are teams, like I said, about being safe with the investment. That would be more of a risky investment because there isn't as much information out there. So like you're going to be taking like a huge risk there in investing in something that hasn't seen results yet. And so that's why I feel like there's a discrepancy between their hitting and their pitching. But yeah, for me, it comes down to just having that idea there and then having people who have been there for a while, like Matt Arnold, I don't think gets enough credit for being there. Yeah, I think he got a little bit overshadowed by David Stearns, but he's been there for a long time. They have some other folks as well. Cam Castro does a great job in their player development. He came from their pitching side of things at first. Now he oversees everything as far as player development goes. Those are two guys, and I can rattle off a bunch of others that have been there for a while, and they've had that continuity in place.
Will, you gave us a great scouting report on Craig Counsell, basically when we were all floored at the GM meetings last November when this went down. And I think Counsell's getting used to Chicago. It's been interesting to like kind of learn some of his ticks. I think has a sense of humor, but he's not like haha funny, and he kind of keeps guarded. He likes very literal, specific questions, and I think he's very honest and forthright. But if you kind of go with a concept filibuster, I'd be like, what are you asking? And I think some people could get turned off by that because he doesn't just like play along for the regional sports network. I was wondering, what was it like covering him on a day-to-day basis in Milwaukee?
Yeah, that is right on. That's a great assessment. That's spot on for me. I think like one story that I could share that would highlight maybe like a little bit of his personality, and he shared it a little bit too. So I think it's kind of funny because somebody had Willie Adames trade a couple of years ago. That always gets that gets picked up in the Milwaukee media sometimes, or at least it used to, because it made such a huge difference for them that specific year. It carried over, whatever. I had once asked him, like, why the hell are you guys doing this? Like, you're trading away 2 pitchers, blah, blah, blah. And like, he brought that up as like, Will Sammon asked me once that, like, well, what were we doing? And so I feel kind of comfortable saying though that like in that conversation though, I just distinctly remember him telling me like, look, Will, it's a trade. Like we gave up something, we got something, we got to give something up. That's how it works. And it's like, that was it. And not all the conversations are that, but in a straight line. But I do find what you said to be spot on, because he's somebody who has like a high BS meter, and he will sniff it out. And if he gets turned off, I think, easily by people who are not prepared and who are not there and who don't have a good feel for like what's going on. And he just doesn't suffer fools in that way. And so I respect that a lot, because you had to come with him and you had to know your stuff. And he sees things, I think, before they happen a lot of times too. But one thing in particular about like even like the pitch clock, when like that was getting talked about, not introduced yet, but just even talked about, he was somebody that told me early on, like, look, they got to be prepared for perhaps some injury issues here, or they have to be prepared for like velocity going down. So he sees things that are like way ahead of the game, I feel like, before they unfold. And I think that's the mark of somebody who just knows their stuff. And obviously he's been around the game his whole life, but he also, I think, had that little area of front office work with the Brewers before he became their manager. And so he's just a guy that I think is like very seamless into the modern day manager type of thing, where you have to work hand in hand with your front office. So yeah, I think like the media side, I'm not there in Chicago, so I don't know the difference between Chicago and Milwaukee with how he's handling things on a day-to-day, but I just know that at the end of the day, he's the right guy for that type of job. Because he deserves it. I think he just is on a different level compared to a lot of people in the game. But secondly, he can handle the harsh criticism, I think, sometimes when things are not unfolding the way that they should be.
Yeah, I'm curious, fans right now want him to go off. I think I noticed yesterday there were a lot of comments from fans that why isn't Counsell defend? The zone was terrible yesterday, but for both ways, and Counsell didn't say much. Bob Melvin got tossed. I think fans wanted to see that happen from Counsell, and they probably have for weeks now. The Brewers, they may always win the division in Cubs fans' eyes and overperform in different ways, but they've had their offensive struggles. So I'm sure they've had a month and a half, 2 months like the Cubs have just had. How was Counsell handling those moments? How does he handle bad moments in general? What sort of things does he do that you've noticed that, okay, this guy is doing this as a tactical thing? He's trying to fire up his team, or does he do things like that? Or is it just what we've heard from Jed and how we've kind of observed? He's very steady. Is that just how it always is.
Yeah, I think he's going to operate more on that level, more on that volume of like he's going to try to be as consistent as possible, and we see that a lot from managers. I think probably too much, right? Because, like, we could use a little bit more characters in this game, but like I think he wants to strike that tone a lot, and I think a lot of that comes down to the message that he wants to send to his players, and so he's never going to. I think he does actually a pretty fair job, or at least he did in Milwaukee. I'm not sure how it is in Chicago, but I think he does a pretty fair job of being like critical or giving you a straight answer on like why somebody is slumping or why something has happened without throwing his guy under the bus. I think he walks that line pretty well for what our expectations are there, because we know that they're usually not going to just slam a guy. So, but I think he does give you some good insight into like why a guy is struggling or why a certain play unfolded the way it did, whatever the case is, without going overboard. I think he's really good at delivering bad news to players too, and I think he really relies on his experience as a player, as somebody who was one of the last guys on the roster kind of thing a lot of times as a utility type. And so I think he understands the delicate balance that's necessary with that. So I think a lot of it that we see sometimes in the media is performative, and it just goes back to that he's just not a fake guy. Like, he's not some kind of like fake tough guy. Like, if he's pissed, you're gonna know he's pissed, and it's gonna be genuine, and it's gonna come out, and it's going to not be some fake for show, I guess. And that's another thing that I really respected about him, is that when you pissed him off or when he was pissed at the game, you knew it right away. Like, there was no guessing.
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen that with Counsell, and like I had said earlier, Will, like, you gave us a great scouting report, and for all our listeners, I can't recommend Will's coverage enough. Even if you're not like a Mets fan, like, you can hear in his answers the depth of his understanding of the game, the contacts and relationships that he has throughout the baseball industry after covering a couple of teams that have had a lot of shuffling going on. That definitely helps as well, that Will's seen really both sides of the big market, small market spectrum. And I think it's always fascinating to read, because you pick up on, like I said earlier, those Mets on the verge of collapse, most expensive flop in baseball history. You're all over that. So Cubs fans, if you want to read, I guess now you're on like the hopeful track of like Cubs fans can look at the Mets and be like, hey, I think you wrote it today of like one good week, and it totally changes the trajectory of your season. But with the way both these teams have gone, there's probably going to be a lot more down moments as well.
Yeah, Will, I'll just echo what Patrick said. If there are young writers or anyone that wants to get into this business, Will is the type of person you should be. He's paying attention to everything, constantly thinking about how he can get better, and just like it stands out among the group very quickly. How long have you been doing this in baseball? 5 years, 6 years?
My first year was 2020, actually, after college football. Yeah.
So not even so. I thought it was longer, but Will immediately stood out, and the Athletic is lucky enough to have young writers like that. But Will has always stood out to me. So I appreciate all the work you do, Will. Appreciate you coming on. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you this weekend in Chicago.
Yeah, it'll be fun, guys. Thanks for having me. Love what you guys do as well.
Thanks, man. Thanks so much for listening to Northside Territory. I'm Sahadev Sharma. That's Patrick Mooney. Make sure to read our work at The Athletic. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review to this podcast on whatever platform you use. We'll be back at you soon talking more Cubs baseball. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.